On the morning of January 13th, 1888, Hattie Granger woke up warm. That was the first sign something was wrong, though she did not know it yet. She was 17 years old and she had lived her entire life on the Nebraska prairie where January mornings were supposed to bite. They were supposed to make you pull your coat tight before the door was even fully open, supposed to remind you that the land you lived on did not care whether you survived it. But that morning when Hattie pressed her palm flat against the bedroom window, the glass was not cold. It was almost gentle. She did not take her heavy coat. The well was 12 meters from the back door. She had walked that path 10,000 times. She knew every inch of it, every frozen rut, every stone half buried in the dirt. She pulled on her light jacket, picked up the water bucket, and stepped outside into the strangest morning she had ever felt on the prairie. The snow was softening at the edges. The air smelled almost like March. Somewhere across the fields, a bird was calling. She made it 4 steps from the door before the sky changed. It did not happen the way storms usually happen, with clouds building and wind rising in slow warning. This was something different. The temperature dropped so fast she felt it as a physical blow, like walking through a wall. The wind did not increase gradually. It simply arrived all at once at full force, driving snow so thick and fast that the farmhouse behind her disappeared in seconds. Not faded, disappeared. One moment it was there, solid and familiar. The next moment there was nothing but white in every direction, white above and white below and white where her hands should have been. Hattie turned around. She thought she was turning back toward the house. She was absolutely certain of it. She had the memory of the house in her bones, the exact angle, the exact distance. 12 meters. She began to walk. 3 days later, her family found her body 180 meters from the house. She was facing away from it. Her arms were still reaching forward, as though she believed home was just ahead, just a few more steps, just beyond the white. She was not alone in dying that way. Across the northern plains of Nebraska and the Dakotas, the storm that history would call the schoolhouse blizzard killed more than 200 people in a single afternoon. Many of them died within sight of their own front doors. The wind chill, a concept that most prairie settlers understood only in their bodies rather than in any scientific language, drove the effective temperature to depths that turned the familiar into a killing field. A walk to the barn, a trip to the well, a distance of 15 meters, of 20, of 30. These were the measurements of death on January 13th, 1888. But on the eastern edge of a small Nebraska settlement called Thornfield, not a single life was lost. 31 people, men and women and children, survived 3 full days of that storm without once setting foot into the open air. They moved between houses and barns and root cellars through a network of underground passages, tunnels dug beneath the frozen earth, shielded from the wind that howled uselessly above their heads. The network held. The people inside it lived. The man who built those tunnels was named Jasper Udell, and until the blizzard proved him right, the people of Thornfield had called him something else entirely. They called him the Mole Man. This is the story of how he came to dig those tunnels. But to understand why he dug them, you have to go back 9 years before the storm to a homestead in Minnesota, to a December evening in 1879, and to 18 meters of open ground between a farmhouse and a barn. Her name was Sadie. She was 40 years old and she had been Jasper Udell's wife for 16 years. She was not a fragile woman. She had crossed 3 states with him, built 2 homes, buried 1 infant, and worked ground that broke lesser people inside of a season. She had a way of laughing that made the room feel warmer. She had hands that were always moving, always doing something, always building something toward the next day. She went out to milk the cows at dusk. It was a chore she had done thousands of times. The barn was 18 meters from the house. The storm rose fast, the way prairie storms often did, without ceremony or warning, from stillness to catastrophe in minutes. Jasper found her the next morning. She was on the ground in the snow, 18 meters from the barn door, her hand outstretched in front of her, as though reaching for something just beyond her fingertips. She had been that close. She had been that close, and the storm had taken her anyway, spinning her around, stealing her sense of direction, turning 18 meters into a labyrinth with no exit. Jasper knelt beside her in the snow. He did not cry. He did not call for help. He did something that the hired hand who found him there would remember for the rest of his life and never fully understand. Jasper took a length of rope from the barn wall. He tied one end around his own wrist. He tied the other end to the handle of the barn door. And then in the middle of a clear morning with no storm and no wind, he walked out into the open field with his eyes closed. He made it 6 meters before he lost the barn. 6 meters of open, flat, familiar ground, and with his eyes shut, he had no idea where the barn was, which direction was the house, which way was north. He stood in the field with the rope taut between his wrist and the door handle and understood something that no one had explained to him and that he had not been able to articulate until that moment. Distance was not the problem. Direction was the problem. And direction vanished the instant you could not see. He walked back to the barn. He untied the rope. He went inside, sat down in the hay, and stayed there until the hired hand came looking for him. That evening, after Sadie's body had been brought inside and arrangements had been made, Jasper sat alone at the kitchen table. He was not a man who had ever considered himself particularly clever, but he had spent 2 years studying civil engineering at a small college in Ohio before his mother fell ill, and he came home to care for her. And in those 2 years, he had learned to think in structures, in problems and solutions, in the mechanics of how things failed and how they could be made not to fail. He opened Sadie's Bible, which was sitting on the table where she had left it that morning before she walked out to the barn. On the inside back cover in the margin beside the last page, he began to draw. Not a prayer, not a letter to her, a diagram, a simple system of connected passages running beneath the ground, from the house to the barn, from the barn to the well. Fully enclosed, no wind, no need to see, no possibility of losing your direction because there was only one direction the passage went. If this had existed, she would be alive. He stared at what he had drawn for a long time. Then he closed the Bible, set it carefully on the shelf, and went to bed. He sold the Minnesota homestead in the spring of 1880. People in the community assumed he was running from grief, and in one sense they were right. But Jasper Udell was not the kind of man who ran from things without bringing something with him. What he brought was the diagram on the inside back cover of Sadie's Bible and the knowledge that he needed land, flat prairie land, with enough space between his buildings to make the tunnels worth digging. He arrived in Thornfield, Nebraska in the spring of 1881. He was 43 years old, a widower, and he carried almost nothing with him except a sorrel gelding named Dusty and a small trunk of tools. He filed a claim on 65 hectares of land on the eastern edge of the settlement, paid the filing fee, and began the hard, familiar work of a homesteader. He built a sod house. He planted a kitchen garden. He built a simple barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar, a well house. His hands, still strong, moved through the work with the efficiency of a man who had done it before and knew exactly what was needed. What nobody in Thornfield knew was that even as he built all of those necessary things, he was measuring the distances between them. The settlement of Thornfield was not a town in any formal sense. There was a general store run by a man named Yarbrough, a one-room church, a one-room schoolhouse, and perhaps 40 households, scattered across a 15-kilometer radius of prairie. The smallness of the place meant that everyone knew everyone, which meant that strangers were noticed and assessed within days of their arrival, and their peculiarities were cataloged and discussed at the general store, in the church, in the sewing circles, in the harvest gatherings. Jasper Udell's peculiarities were assessed fairly quickly. The first was that he lived alone and seemed to prefer it. The second was that he was polite but not forthcoming, the kind of man who answered questions without inviting more of them. The third, which became apparent within his first week in Thornfield, was that he spent an unusual amount of time walking the ground between his buildings with a length of rope measuring distances and writing numbers in a small leather notebook. He met Prescott Plunkett on his third day in the settlement at Yarbrough's general store. Plunkett owned 130 hectares, the largest holding in the eastern part of Thornfield, and he employed 2 hired men. He was not a cruel man or an unintelligent one, but he had built his prosperity through a combination of hard work and the absolute conviction that his judgment was sound, and over the years, those 2 things had become difficult to separate. He assessed new arrivals the way he assessed new livestock, quickly and with confidence in his own conclusions. He looked at Jasper Udell's hands, his worn coat, the leather notebook in his breast pocket. He asked where Udell had come from, how much land he had taken on, whether he had capital. Jasper answered each question in a single sentence. Plunkett nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has gathered the information he needed. He did not introduce himself by name. He simply said as he was leaving, "Welcome to Thornfield. You'll find we do things a particular way out here. Best to learn what that is before you start doing things your own way." He left without explaining what that way was. Jasper Udell met Reverend Clem on his first Sunday in Thornfield after the church service. Clem was 55 years old, tall and thin, with the kind of deliberate voice that had spent decades being heard over the ambient noise of congregation and prairie wind. He shook Jasper's hand with both of his the way men of faith do when they are genuinely welcoming someone rather than simply going through the motions. "I'm glad you've come," Clem said. "We lose people sometimes to loneliness as much as anything else. A man alone on the prairie has too much silence and not enough humanity." He smiled, but his eyes were measuring. "Don't try to live out here alone, Mr. Udell. That's the way men go strange." Jasper thanked him and walked home. He met Dr. Weston Fenwick a week later when a gash on his left palm from a fence wire required a few stitches. Fenwick was 38, sharp-eyed and quick in conversation in a way that was unusual among men who spent their days working with their hands. When he heard that Jasper had studied civil engineering, he asked 3 specific questions about load-bearing calculations before the stitches were finished. And when Jasper answered them accurately, something shifted in Fenwick's expression. Not quite respect, but the particular attention that one careful thinker pays to another. "We don't get many engineers in Thornfield," Fenwick said. "I'm not an engineer," Jasper said. "I studied for 2 years, then my mother got sick." "What do you plan to do with it now?" Jasper looked at his bandaged hand. "Something I should have done earlier," he said, and he left it at that. He started digging in June of 1881. The first tunnel would connect his house to his barn. He began at dawn and worked until the heat of the morning drove him inside, then resumed in the evening when the soil had cooled. The ground was not cooperative. Nebraska prairie earth was dense with the compressed roots of decades of grass studded with rocks that had to be worked around or pried out thick and resistant in a way that made every foot of forward progress feel like an argument. The shovel hit resistance on every stroke. Some mornings the blade came back with nothing but a small, shuddering denial from the earth. But Jasper had something that grief had given him in abundance. He had patience, and he had nowhere else to be. He dug down 1.5 meters first, establishing the depth of the passage. This was the most important decision in the construction, and he made it based on something he had calculated carefully before he ever put the shovel in the ground. Below approximately 1.5 meters, the temperature of the earth remained stable year-round, hovering around 10 degrees Celsius regardless of what the sky was doing above. The ground at that depth did not freeze. The wind at that depth did not exist. This was the principle the entire system rested on, and he needed to explain it to no one because he intended to build it for himself, and no one else would need to understand it until it had already proven what it was. He shored the walls with timber cut from cottonwood trees along the creek. The passage was 1 2/10 meters wide and 1.5 meters tall, cramped enough that a full-grown man had to walk with a slight hunch, but wide enough to lead an animal through in an emergency. He laid gravel on the floor for drainage and fitted simple wooden doors at each end to control airflow and keep out the small creatures that regarded underground spaces as their territory. The tunnel stretched 18 meters. It took 3 months to complete. On the September morning when he finally emerged from the barn, squinting in the sunlight, he stood for a moment in the barn doorway and looked back down the length of what he had built. It was dark down there and narrow and smelled of earth and raw wood. It was not beautiful. He had gone in the evening before with no lantern just to test it. He had walked its full length in complete darkness, one hand trailing the timbered wall, and emerged through the barn door into the night air, knowing exactly where he was, exactly which direction was, exactly how far he had come. For 45 seconds, he had moved through total blindness and arrived precisely where he intended to arrive. He had stood in the barn in the dark with his horse Dusty watching him from the stall, and he had wept. It was the first time he had cried since the morning he found Sadie in the snow. He wept not because the tunnel was finished, but because for 45 seconds he had moved through darkness and known exactly where he was. He had found the barn. He had found the door. He had arrived. The simple, brutal fact of arriving somewhere you intended to go felt in that moment like the most important thing he had ever accomplished. The next morning he was standing at the barn end when his neighbor to the north came riding past. Prescott Plunkett saw the fresh-turned earth and the timber framing, and the low-profile door set into the ground, and he pulled his bay mare to a stop. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Jasper. "You, Dell," he said, "what in God's name have you built?" "A tunnel," Jasper said, "connects the house to the barn." Plunkett stared at him. Then he laughed, the kind of laugh that is meant to be heard, that carries across open ground and lands on the ears of anyone nearby as a verdict. "You've dug yourself a tunnel to your barn, 18 meters underground, so you don't have to walk 18 meters above ground." He shook his head slowly, still laughing. "The sun has cooked something loose in you, man. That's the only explanation." He wrote on. Word of the tunnel spread through Thornfield within a week, which was about how long it always took for anything unusual to complete its circuit through a small community. At Yarborough's general store, men talked about it with the pleased contempt that settled communities reserve for those who deviate from the understood ways of doing things. Someone said Udell was digging to China, and the name stuck long enough that several children began calling him the Chinaman before settling collectively on a name that seemed more accurate. The Mole Man. Children are efficient in their cruelty, not because they intend cruelty, but because they are direct, and the directness lands where adults of more elaborate mockery sometimes misses. Jasper heard the name from a group of children outside the general store one Saturday morning and registered it without expression. He went inside, bought the supplies he needed, and went home. He was aware that the laughter was not entirely harmless. A community's opinion of a man shapes what that man can and cannot accomplish within it. And Jasper understood that he would need his neighbors eventually in ways he had not yet fully articulated, even to himself. But he also understood that the tunnel had not been built for their approval, and that the work still ahead of him could not wait for approval that might never come. Plunkett took the tunnel as a personal mission. He was not a malicious man, but he had a community standing to maintain, and a settled conviction that the way things were done in Thornfield was the way things ought to be done, and Jasper Udell was a disruption to both. At a harvest gathering that autumn, Plunkett addressed the assembled families. "The man is not right in his mind," he said, and his voice carried across the room with the authority of a man who had practiced being listened to. "First his wife freezes to death, and now he spends his days underground like some kind of burrowing creature. It's unhealthy, it's unnatural, and frankly, it's the kind of thing that gives a settlement a bad reputation with people who might otherwise consider settling here." His wife Odessa nodded firmly. Several others murmured agreement. Most simply looked at their plates. Jasper was not at this gathering. He had not been invited and would not have gone if he had. 2 weeks later, Plunkett organized a meeting at his own house, inviting the larger landholders of the eastern settlement. His stated purpose was to discuss whether the tunnels posed a risk to the structural integrity of the surrounding land. He had no evidence that they did. He had, in fact, no particular knowledge of soil mechanics or foundation engineering. But the concerns sounded technical and therefore legitimate, and several men who might otherwise have stayed home came to hear it discussed. Dr. Weston Fenwick was invited because he was the most formally educated person in the settlement. Plunkett asked him directly whether underground tunnels at shallow depths could cause the surrounding land to sink or destabilize. Fenwick had spent the week before the meeting visiting Jasper Udell's property and inspecting the construction himself. He had asked Jasper technical questions and received precise answers. He had walked the tunnel. He had examined the timbering. He looked at Plunkett across the assembled men and said, "At 1.5 meters depth, with the timber spacing and soil composition on Mr. Udell's land, there is no meaningful risk of surface subsidence. The construction is sound." Plunkett's face went through several expressions quickly. "You've inspected it," he said. "I have," Fenwick said. When I thought it was important to have an accurate answer to the question before offering an opinion on it." The meeting ended without resolution. The men went home. Plunkett went to bed angry, which was for him the particular anger of a man who had expected vindication and received facts instead. The following Sunday, Reverend Clem delivered a sermon that contained no direct references to tunnels or to Jasper Udell. It was a sermon about the sin of pride, about the ways that men in their arrogance sought to replace divine providence with the work of their own hands, about the danger of trusting in human construction over heavenly protection. Everyone in the church understood what the sermon was about. They looked at their hymnals, or at their hands, or at the middle distance, the way congregations do when a sermon is aimed at someone specific and hits everyone adjacent to them. Jasper sat in the back row. He did not bow his head during the prayer at the end of the service. He sat with his back straight and his eyes open, looking at the plain wooden cross above the altar. After the service, when the congregation filed out into the autumn morning, Clem found Jasper on the church steps. He placed a hand on Jasper's shoulder, and his voice was genuinely kind, which in some ways made what he said harder to receive. "I worry about you," Clem said. "There are wounds that picks and shovels cannot reach. The grief you carry, the way you've turned inward with it, this is not the path toward healing. Come to supper with us. Let people know you. Let the community be what it's supposed to be." Jasper looked at him steadily. "Reverend, I appreciate the concern, but I want to ask you something honestly. If Sadie had died because the barn roof collapsed and I spent 2 years building stronger roofs, would you tell me that picks and shovels weren't the answer?" Clem's hand dropped from his shoulder. "That's not the same thing." "I know you believe that," Jasper said. "I'm less certain." He walked down the steps and home across the prairie. Clem watched him go. It was Isham Whitmore who stopped him on the road that afternoon, coming from the opposite direction on a horse that looked like it had been running. Isham was 26, lean and cheerful in the way of young men who have not yet been seriously tested by anything, and he had been in Thornfield for only a year longer than Jasper. He pulled up alongside him and said without preamble, "I didn't think the sermon was about anything that needed saying." Jasper looked up at him. "Thank you. I'm Isham Whitmore. My place is east of yours about 300 meters. My wife's name is Abigail." He paused. "She thinks you're strange, but she also thinks Plunkett is a windbag, and she's not wrong about that." Jasper almost smiled. It was as close as he had come to smiling in some time. Isham rode on. Jasper stood in the road for a moment, then continued home. That night, alone in the sod house, he sat at the table and looked at the notebook where he kept his measurements and diagrams. He had been thinking of the tunnel system as a thing he was building for himself, a private answer to a private loss. But sitting at the table with the prairie wind, finding every crack in the sod walls, he thought about the Whitmore family, 300 meters to the east, about Abigail and whatever child they might have one day, about the distance between their barn and their house, about all the barns and all the houses in the eastern settlement and all the distances between them. He was not finished. He had known somewhere below conscious thought that he was not finished. The tunnel from his house to his barn was only the first sentence of something much longer. The winter of 1881 confirmed it in a way he had not anticipated. In January, on a night when the temperature dropped to -20, but the sky was clear and no storm was coming, he heard a sound at his door. It was Isham Whitmore breathing hard, his coat dusted with frost, his face drawn tight with the particular terror of a man whose fear is not for himself. Abigail was in labor, he said, weeks early. The horse had gone lame that afternoon. He had run 300 meters through the cold to get Jasper. They ran back together, Jasper with his medical box under his arm, and the labor turned out to be a false alarm. The baby staying put for another 6 weeks, and Abigail was fine, embarrassed, and relieved in equal measure. They sat around the small stove and drank coffee, and Isham laughed about it with the shaky laughter of a man who had run through a January night with his heart in his throat. On the walk back across the dark prairie, the cold settled fully around Jasper, and he stopped halfway between the two homesteads. He stood in the flat dark and looked east toward his own house, then west toward the faint glow of the Whitmore window. 300 meters. No storm, no wind, no emergency beyond the ordinary fear of a first-time father. And even so, Isham had nearly run himself into trouble getting there, had almost taken the wrong track in the dark, had been for a few minutes not entirely certain where he was. Jasper stood in the cold and did the calculation he should have been doing all along. He did not go home immediately. He walked the ground between the two properties instead, measuring in strides, noting the terrain, feeling where the soil changed from packed clay to the softer earth near the small creek that ran between their lands. He made notes in his head. He went over the numbers twice. By the time he went inside, the next tunnel had already taken shape in his mind. Not for himself, for the Whitmores. And beyond them, for whoever else was willing to listen to a man they had already decided was not quite right in his head. He did not know yet how long it would take to change their minds. He did not know yet about the fire or the blizzard or the particular price that Prescott Plunkett would pay for the certainty he wore like armor. He did not know that 31 people would one day owe their lives to the work he was about to begin. He only knew that 300 meters of open Nebraska prairie lay between two families who might one day need each other in the dark, and that darkness was something he knew how to solve. He picked up his shovel the next morning. The Whitmore baby came in February, 6 weeks after the false alarm, on a night so cold the window glass cracked from the inside. Jasper was there before the labor was half finished, walking the 300 meters between the homesteads in the dark, with a lantern that the wind kept trying to extinguish. He stood in the corner of the small room and handed Abigail water and clean cloth and said nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say, and Dr. Weston Fenwick was 12 kilometers away and could not have made the ride in that cold, even if anyone had thought to send for him. The baby arrived just after midnight. A girl. Isham held her against his chest and looked at her with the expression men get when they encounter something they had not understood was possible until it was directly in front of them. They named her Jessamine. Jasper walked home in the dark with an empty lantern, the oil burned out navigating by starlight and the memory of the ground beneath his feet. He made it without difficulty. He had walked that stretch enough times to know every dip and stone. But halfway home, he stopped, turned, and looked back at the faint glow of the Whitmore window against the darkness. 300 meters. That was the distance between those two lights. 300 meters of open ground with nothing between them. No shelter, no guidance, no connection. If the night had been a bad one with a storm instead of clear cold, Isham Whitmore might not have made it to his door 2 months ago. And whatever happened inside that house, Abigail and the baby would have faced it alone. He turned back toward home and began calculating. He went to see Isham Whitmore in the spring of 1882, on a morning when the snow had retreated enough to show the dead grass underneath, and the sky had the pale-washed look of a season not yet committed to warmth. He sat at the Whitmore table and drank coffee and listened to Isham talk about the coming planting season and the price of seed corn and the fence line that needed replacing along the south pasture. Then when the coffee was finished, he said what he had come to say. "When you ran to my place in January," Jasper said, "if the weather had been bad, you wouldn't have made it." Isham looked at him. "It wasn't bad. It will be some year, and when it is, the distance between your place and mine will matter more than either of us wants to think about." Isham was quiet. He understood what Jasper was building toward, because the whole settlement knew what Jasper Udell did with his time, and it was not a complicated conclusion to reach. "You want to dig a tunnel," Isham said. "I want to connect your root cellar to my barn, 60 meters more or less depending on the line. I'll do the work. I'll supply the materials. I'm asking for your permission to dig beneath your land and your labor when you can spare it." Abigail Whitmore came in from the back room. She had heard. Her face held the particular expression of a woman who has already made her decision but wants the conversation to confirm it before she commits. "I don't want my daughter growing up thinking that crawling underground is a normal way to live," she said. It was not angry, it was the statement of a woman protecting something. "She won't think that," Jasper said. "She'll think it's a way to live when living above ground becomes impossible, which is different." Abigail looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "The door on our side, it locks from the inside. I'll build it that way." She went back into the other room. Isham looked at Jasper with an expression that mixed relief with something more complicated. "She's not wrong about the door," he said. "She's not wrong about anything," Jasper said. "That's why I'm agreeing with her." Isham began helping on weekends. He was not a natural underground worker. He dug with energy but without precision, and Jasper spent nearly as much time adjusting Isham's cuts as making his own. But there was something in working alongside another person that Jasper had not felt since before Sadie died, a rhythm of shared effort that required no conversation to maintain, and that made the silence between two men into something companionable rather than empty. They dug in the mornings and ate at the Whitmore table at midday and returned to the ground in the afternoons, and by autumn the passage was taking real shape. The tunnel was finished in November of 1884. 60 meters of underground passage properly timbered and drained with heavy wooden doors at each end that latched from the inside. The day they opened it for the first time as a completed thing, Abigail came down into the passage with Jessamine on her hip. The girl was 4 years old and had her father's curiosity and her mother's directness, and the moment her feet touched the tunnel floor, she twisted out of her mother's arms and ran. She ran the full 60 meters in the near dark, her small feet on the gravel floor, her breath puffing white in the cold air, and she burst out through the far door into Jasper's barn and turned around and shouted back into the darkness with the full force of her 4-year-old lungs. "Daddy, I'm at Mr. Jasper's house. I'm here." Isham stood at the near end of the tunnel and laughed. It was the unguarded laugh of a man who had not expected to feel what he was feeling. He looked at Jasper, and Jasper looked at him, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying. A 4-year-old girl had just run 60 meters underground and arrived exactly where she intended to arrive, and she had done it in the near dark, and she had not been afraid. Jasper thought about this later alone. He thought about what it meant that the child had not been afraid. She had not known to be afraid. She had seen a passage and run through it because she was 4 years old, and passages were for running through, and darkness was only an inconvenience if you expected light. Word of the tunnel between the Udell and Whitmore properties spread through Thornfield, the way all news spread there quickly and with editorial additions. The mockery resumed quieter now than it had been in 1881, but present a background frequency of derision that Jasper had learned to register without responding to. Then came Celia Quarles. Celia was the wife of Kellum Quarles, who farmed the land east of the Whitmore property. She was 41 years old, practical and unsentimental in her manner, and she had lost a child to lung sickness in 1881 and had not entirely recovered from it in the way that people say they recover from things, meaning she had continued living and working but had not stopped being afraid. The tunnel, when she first heard about it, activated that fear directly. Underground spaces meant darkness and damp and the particular closeness of the earth that she associated in a way she could not entirely rationalize with graves. She went to Abigail Whitmore first. Abigail told her the door locked from the inside. Celia was not reassured. She went to Dr. Fenwick. She asked him directly the way she asked all questions whether underground passages were unhealthy for children, specifically whether the confined air and the soil moisture would damage young lungs. Fenwick had inspected Jasper's system twice by that point. He had noted the gravel drainage, the timber spacing, the simple ventilation that the door gaps provided. He looked at Celia across his examining table and answered her honestly. "The interior of that tunnel is drier than most sod houses in winter," he said. "The drainage system works. The airflow, while limited, is adequate for passage rather than habitation. I would not recommend anyone living in it permanently. For moving between buildings in an emergency, I see no medical objection." Celia looked at him for a moment. "That's not what I wanted you to say." "I know," Fenwick said, "but it's what I found." She left his office and went directly to Jasper Udell's property. She had never spoken to him at length before. She stood at his door, and when he opened it, looked at him with an expression that contained everything she had been carrying since the conversation with Fenwick, and had not yet resolved into anything simpler. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Not for your own property, for other people's, for the Whitmores. Why?" Jasper considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because if only my homestead has tunnels," he said, "I'll still have to stand here and watch when my neighbors die out there." Celia was quiet for a long moment. "If something happened to my children," she said finally, "because I said no to something that could have protected them, I don't think I could carry that." "No," Jasper said, "you couldn't." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one. "When can you start on my side?" she said. Kellum Quarles heard about his wife's decision that evening and responded with the blunt pragmatism of a man for whom questions of cost and labor took precedence over questions of principle. He found Jasper the next morning and asked 3 questions in rapid succession. Who would pay for the materials? Who would do the majority of the labor? And what Kellum would be expected to contribute in return? Jasper answered all 3. Kellum nodded once. "All right then," he said, and turned to go back to his work. Jasper almost smiled. In a settlement full of people who had very strong feelings about his tunnels, Kellum Quarles's complete indifference to the philosophical dimensions of the project was in its own way a relief. The summer of 1885 was dry, the way Nebraska summers sometimes were, the kind of dry that turned the grass to tinder and made every rancher look at the sky in the late afternoon with a particular set to their jaw. In June, a storm moved through the territory and left behind it not rain but lightning, scattered across 40 kilometers of dry ground, and 3 separate fires started within an hour of each other on the western prairie. The Whitmore homestead was not in the direct path of the largest fire, but it was close enough that the smoke was visible from the house by mid-morning, and the air smelled of burning grass and something hotter underneath it. Asham was east of the house working the fence line when the wind shifted. Abigail saw the sky change from the kitchen window. She did not hesitate. She had walked the tunnel twice since it was finished, once with Isham and once alone testing the door latch. She knew the distance. She knew what was at the other end. She took Jessamine under one arm and the lantern in the other hand and went down through the root cellar through the door into the passage. The tunnel was dark and the smell of smoke was faint but present, finding its way through the soil above as a suggestion rather than a threat. Jessamine did not cry. She wrapped her arms around her mother's neck and watched the darkness ahead of them, with wide eyes that held more interest than fear. Abigail moved through the passage with her lantern throwing orange light on the timbered walls and came out the far end into Jasper's barn, where the smell of hay and horses replaced the smell of smoke as completely as a door closing on a different room. She sat down on a hay bale and held Jessamine against her chest and breathed. Jasper found them 20 minutes later. He had seen the smoke from the south field and come back at a run. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at Abigail and Jessamine sitting in the hay, and Abigail looked at him, and there was a long moment in which neither of them said anything, because what had just happened did not require narration. "Isham's out east," Abigail said. "He'll be all right. The fire's moving the wrong way for him." "I know," Jasper said. "I can see the line from the hill." He sat down on the opposite hay bale, and they waited together while the fire burned itself out against the creek bed to the west. When Isham came in through the barn door 2 hours later, smelling of smoke and moving fast, and found his wife and daughter sitting calmly in Jasper Udell's barn, eating the bread and dried apple that Jasper had produced from somewhere, he stopped in the doorway and put one hand on the frame to steady himself. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at Abigail and then at Jessamine and then at Jasper. "The tunnel," he said. "The tunnel," Jasper said. The next morning, Celia Quarles came to Jasper's property. She did not come to discuss the fire exactly or to offer sympathy or to make any of the social gestures that occasions like this usually demanded. She came with a single question. "How long before the passage on our side is finished?" she said. "3 months, Jasper said. "Maybe 4. "Make it 3, she said and went home. It was Obadiah Gaston who completed the eastern cluster of the network. Gaston was 68 years old, lived alone on 40 hectares north of the Quarles property, and had come to Nebraska a decade ago from Indiana, where he had spent 30 years as a building carpenter before his joints made fine work impossible. He found Jasper at Yarbrough's general store on a November afternoon and introduced himself with the directness of an old man who has stopped having patience for preamble. "I want to talk to you about your tunnels," Gaston said. "All right. Not to argue about them. I understand what you're doing and I think it's sound. I want to know if you'd be willing to extend the system to my property." He paused. "I'm 68 years old, I live alone, and last winter I didn't see another person for 11 days during a cold snap. Nobody knew that. Nobody would have known if something had happened to me for 2-3 days after it did." Jasper looked at him. "I'll come out next week to look at the line." Gaston nodded. "One more thing. I was a carpenter for 30 years. I know something about timbering and soil. If you'll let me, I'd like to contribute more than just permission to dig." They worked on the Gaston extension through the winter of 1885 and into the spring of 1886. Gaston was right about his knowledge. He had practical experience with underground construction from a well-digging project in Indiana, and he identified 2 places where Jasper's planned line would run through softer soil near an old creek bed and would require denser timbering than the standard spacing. He showed Jasper how to stagger the supports to distribute the load differently, a technique Jasper had read about but never executed. They worked in the kind of silence that forms between people who respect each other's competence. Gaston moved slowly but accurately, every cut deliberate, no material wasted. One afternoon, sitting at the bottom of the passage eating lunch, he looked at the completed section of wall and said, "You know what's funny about this whole thing?" Jasper waited. "There's nothing complicated about it. Anybody with a shovel and some lumber and enough patience could build this. The hard part was never the engineering." "What was the hard part?" Jasper said, though he suspected he knew. Gaston bit into his bread and chewed for a moment. "Convincing people they needed it before they needed it. That's the only truly difficult part of any construction project. Getting people to imagine the failure before it happens." Jasper looked at the wall of the tunnel and said nothing. By the autumn of 1886, the Eastern Network connected 6 homesteads: Jasper's property, the Whitmores, the Quarles, Obadiah, Gaston, and 2 smaller families who had approached Jasper in the months after the fire, drawn by the combination of Celia Quarles's directness and Abigail Whitmore's willingness to describe matter-of-factly and without dramatics what it had felt like to walk through the tunnel with a child on her arm while smoke moved through the air above her. The network had one significant gap. Prescott Plunkett's property sat between the eastern cluster and 7 homesteads further west that had no underground connection to anything. Jasper had known about this gap for 2 years. He had been considering how to address it for most of that time. In October of 1886, he rode to Plunkett's property. Plunkett met him at the door with an expression that suggested he had been expecting this visit and had prepared himself for it. He was 51 years old and had spent the last 5 years watching his certainty about Jasper Udell turn from amusement to irritation to something he had not yet named, but that sat uneasily in his chest on quiet evenings. Jasper explained the proposal without ornamentation. A passage through Plunkett's land would complete the circuit connecting the eastern cluster to the western homesteads that were currently isolated. He would do the work. He would supply the materials. He asked only for permission to dig. Plunkett listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a moment. "If I agree to this," he said, "I'm telling the whole of Thornfield that you were right and I was wrong. You understand that?" "I understand that's how you'd see it," Jasper said. "That's how everyone would see it." "Maybe," Jasper said. "Or maybe they'd see a man who was willing to change his mind when the situation called for it. There's a different reputation in that if you want it." Plunkett's jaw tightened. "I built everything I have above ground, Udell. My house, my barn, my reputation. Everything. If I let you dig under my land, I'm saying that what I built above it isn't enough." "It isn't enough," Jasper said. It was not cruel. It was simply accurate, and Plunkett knew it, and that was precisely the problem. The silence between them stretched for a long time. "No," Plunkett said finally. His voice was flat and certain, all the bluster gone out of it. What remained was something older and less comfortable. "I will not have tunnels dug under my land." Jasper looked at him for a moment. He had known this was a possible answer. He had prepared himself for it. He nodded once, turned, and walked back to his horse. He rode home and took out his surveying notebook and looked at the map of the network he had drawn there. He put a finger on the gap where Plunkett's land sat. He thought about the 7 homesteads on the other side of it. He thought about what Obadiah Gaston had said about the hard part of any construction project being the part that happened before the first shovel went in the ground. He folded the notebook and put it in the drawer. He did not take it out again for more than a year. The following Sunday, Reverend Clem found him after the service and walked with him for a short distance along the road, which was the way Clem conducted his most serious conversations, in motion and in the open, where the sky above and the ground beneath served as some kind of witness. "You went to Plunkett," Clem said. It was not a question. "I did." He said no. "He did." Clem walked in silence for a moment. "You're dividing this community, Jasper. Not intentionally, I believe, but the network you've built connects some people and excludes others, and that division will harden over time." Jasper looked at the road ahead. "I'm not the one doing the dividing, Reverend. I extended the offer to every property between mine and the western edge of the settlement. Some people accepted and some didn't. That's their choice, not mine. But the consequence of that choice falls differently on different people." "Yes," Jasper said, "it does." He stopped walking. "If you're asking me to stop building because the network is incomplete, I can't do that. And if you're asking Plunkett to participate, I'd welcome it. But I can't stop a river from flowing because someone is choosing to stand on the bank." Clem stopped beside him. His face held something that was not quite irritation and not quite admiration, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. "What happens," Clem said, "if the storm comes while the network is still incomplete?" Jasper looked at him. "Then God help the people on the other side of the gap," he said. He walked home alone. The winter of 1887 began gently, the way some of the worst things begin. December was cold but manageable, the kind of cold that settled into a routine rather than demanding a response. The snow came in moderate amounts and the wind distributed it evenly, and homesteaders went about the ordinary business of winter tending stock and repairing tools and discussing politics and crop prices at Yarborough's store. January arrived the same way. The first 2 weeks were unremarkable. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, the temperature rose. It rose significantly, conspicuously in a way that should have been a warning, but instead arrived as a gift. The snow that had accumulated since November began to soften at the edges. Children left for school in lighter coats. Farmers went out to check their animals and felt the strange pleasure of the cold loosening its hold, the air carrying almost the promise of something different. Jasper Udell felt it too. He stood outside his door in the morning and put his face into the wind and felt the warmth, and the warmth felt wrong to him in a way he could not immediately articulate. He had lived through 10 Nebraska winters by then, and he had learned to read the moods of the prairie the way a careful man reads the faces of people he has known for years. This warmth had a quality to it that was not generous. It was the quality of a held breath. He spent the morning checking the tunnel system. He walked every passage testing the doors, checking the timber, supports, filling the oil reservoirs in every lantern he had stored in the passages. He noted where the gravel drainage had shifted and packed it back into place. He checked the ventilation gaps and cleared two of them that had become partially blocked by drifted soil. He worked through the morning with the focused efficiency of a man preparing for something specific, and when he finished, he stood at the junction of three passages beneath his barn and listened. Above him, the prairie was warm and quiet and deceptive. He emerged into the afternoon light and saddled Dusty and rode the circuit of the network, stopping at each homestead in turn. At each stop, he said the same thing without dramatic emphasis, without alarm that he did not actually feel, but also without the reassurance that might have caused people to dismiss what he was telling them. Something is coming, he said at each door. I don't know when. Tomorrow maybe, or the day after. Prepare for a serious storm. Know where your tunnel entrance is. Make sure the latch works. At the Whitmore house, Isham looked at the warm blue sky and said, It's almost 40 degrees out there, Jasper. I know, Jasper said. You think a storm is coming. I think the prairie is doing something it does sometimes before a very bad storm. It breathes out warm air first. Isham looked at the scheme. Abigail, listening from inside, appeared in the doorway and said nothing. She looked at Jasper and then went back inside and began stacking additional coal beside the stove. At Plunkett's property, 400 meters from the edge of the network, Jasper did not stop. The tunnel did not reach there. His warning could not reach there either, not in any form that Plunkett would receive as something other than an occasion for further contempt. He rode past the long fence line of Plunkett's land and did not look at the house. That evening, Plunkett's hired man Aldous asked him whether they should bring extra feed into the barn and whether he should check the coal supply in the house. Aldous was 23 years old, from County Clare in Ireland and Nebraska for 6 months, cheerful and competent, and not yet familiar enough with prairie weather to read its signals. Plunkett looked out the window at the warm evening sky. It's fine, he said. No storm coming on a night like this. Aldous nodded and went back to his work. He would be up early the next morning to carry water from the well house to the barn. It was a short walk, 30 meters no more. A simple errand. Plunkett went to bed. In the dark of January 12th, while Thornfield slept in the unusual warmth, a mass of Arctic air moved south from Canada with a speed and density that made everything that had come before it in that winter seem like a rehearsal. By the time it crossed the territorial border, it was moving at 70 kilometers per hour and carrying temperatures that would fall 40 degrees in the course of a single hour. It carried snow so fine and so dense that it would reduce visibility to zero within seconds of arrival. It reached Thornfield at mid-morning on January 13th. Isham Whitmore was in his barn when the sky changed. He had been there since first light, tending to a horse that had thrown a shoe, and he was bent over the animal's left foreleg when the sound reached him. It was not the sound of wind, as he understood wind. It was something lower and more total, a pressure change, as much as a sound, the way a door feels when it is about to open onto something enormous. He straightened up and looked at the barn's small window. The sky was black, not storm dark, not gray or purple, or the greenish yellow of severe weather. Black the way night is black, total and without gradation, and it was moving toward him at a speed that his mind refused to process correctly. He ran for the tunnel. He crossed the barn floor in 6 steps, found the door in the east wall by memory, more than sight pulled it open, and went through it and down. Behind him, the barn doors blew off their hinges with a sound like a cannon shot. Snow poured through in a wall of white that erased everything behind him in seconds. He pulled the tunnel door closed from the inside and sat in the sudden, absolute quiet of the underground, breathing hard back against the timber wall, and listened to the world above him come apart. The silence inside the tunnel was not actually silence. He could hear the storm through the earth, a low, constant vibration the way you hear traffic through the walls of a building. But it was muffled, contained, manageable. He picked up the lantern from its hook on the wall, lit it, and began moving toward Jasper's barn. 400 meters away on the other side of Prescott Plunkett's land, and the gap it represented in the network, Aldous stepped out of the well house with a bucket of water in each hand. The morning had been warm when he started. His coat was not the heaviest one. The well house was 30 meters from the barn. The storm arrived between one step and the next. Aldous turned toward the barn, or toward where the barn had been. The white was complete and instantaneous, the way a light goes out, nothing gradual about it. He took 3 steps in the direction he believed the barn to be, and stopped because the ground under his feet was no longer telling him anything useful, and the wind was hitting him from so many directions at once that he could not determine which way was which. He was still holding both buckets. The water in them began to freeze. He took another step, and another. He was moving. He was certain he was moving in the right direction. He was absolutely certain of it, the way Hattie Granger had been certain, the way Sadie Udell had been certain, the way 200 people across the northern plains were certain in the minutes before the cold took them. The buckets were very heavy. He kept walking. The tunnel held. That was the first thing, the foundational thing, the thing that made everything else possible. In the hours after the storm arrived, while the world above reduced itself to a single annihilating whiteness, the network of passages beneath the eastern settlement of Thornfield functioned exactly as Jasper Udell had designed it to function 7 years before, when he was a grieving widower, drawing diagrams by lamplight and nobody was watching. Isham Whitmore reached Jasper's barn in 15 minutes, moving through 60 meters of underground passage, with a lantern in one hand and his heart still hammering from the sprint across the barn floor. He came up through the barn door and found Jasper already there, already moving, already pulling coats from the wall, and filling a second lantern from the oil tin on the shelf. "Abigail and Jessamine," Isham said immediately. "They're in the house," Jasper said. "The tunnel from the house runs to the root cellar. She knows. She'll bring them through." "How do you know she'll know to come?" "Because she told me 3 years ago that she would," Jasper said. He handed Isham a lantern. "Take this and go back through. Bring them here. Then go through the Whitmore side to the Quarles connection and make sure Kellum and Celia know the eastern passage is open." Isham took the lantern. He went back down into the tunnel without another word. What followed in the first hours of the storm was not heroic in any dramatic sense. It was organizational. It was the kind of work that looks simple from the outside because the people doing it are too focused to perform it. Jasper moved through his section of the network, continuously checking the lanterns, monitoring the doors, making sure the ventilation gaps were not being blocked by drifting snow on the surface. He counted people as they came through. He noted who had arrived and who had not. By noon, there were 23 people in the network. By late afternoon, when the temperature outside had fallen to levels that made any exposed skin dangerous within minutes, there were 31. 2 families who had not been formally connected to the network had heard the storm coming and run for the nearest tunnel entrance they knew about, pounding on the exterior doors and shouting, and had been led in through the Quarles connection with 30 seconds to spare. Celia Quarles organized the interior without being asked. She moved through the connected spaces of the network, with a list she had made in her head and assigning positions, distributing the food that had been brought from the various root cellars, identifying which children needed to be kept near, which adults for warmth. She had never been given authority over anything beyond her own household, but in the first 4 hours of the storm, she assumed the logistics of 31 lives with the calm efficiency of a woman who had always known she was capable of more than she had been asked to do. "Celia," Kellum Quarles said at one point, watching his wife move through the crowded barn space, directing people twice her age, "I didn't know you could do this." "I know," she said without breaking stride. Obadiah Gaston had fallen that morning before the storm arrived, slipping on ice near his well, and had injured his hip badly enough that he could not walk without support. The Quarles boys had reached him through the tunnel within an hour of the storm's onset and brought him through on a makeshift stretcher made from 2 fence rails and a horse blanket. He was in pain and could not lie flat, but he was alive and warm and surrounded by people, which was the exact opposite of what his situation would have been without the network. Dr. Weston Fenwick had been at the Whitmore house since the previous evening, treating a respiratory infection in Jessamine that he had wanted to monitor overnight. The storm caught him there. He was not in his own home with his medical bag, but he had a traveling kit with him, which was enough. He examined Gaston's hip, confirmed the fracture was partial rather than complete, and established a protocol for keeping the old man comfortable through the 3 days ahead. He worked with the focused quietness of a man who has trained for emergencies and is now simply doing the thing he trained for. The network's largest space was Jasper's barn. It had the highest ceiling and the most floor area, and it became the gathering point for the community in the hours when movement through the passages was possible. People sat on hay bales and on the packed earth floor and on the low timber that ran along the east wall. Children slept in the corners. The horses pushed to one end of the space and separated by a temporary rail that Kellum quarrels rigged from available lumber were calmer than anyone had expected. Animals, it turned out, responded to the presence of other living things in the cold the same way people did. On the second night, the storm outside reached its full intensity. The sound through the earth was a constant low roar, omnipresent and unvarying. The way very loud sounds eventually become a kind of silence through sheer persistence. Inside the network, people had settled into the rhythms of close-quarter survival, the sharing of food and warmth, and the small necessary courtesies of people who have no privacy and must therefore choose kindness as a practical matter. It was in this second night that Abigail Whitmore's labor began. She had been 7.5 months pregnant, and she had told no one, not even Asham, how much discomfort she had been in since the storm arrived. She had told herself it was the cold and the stress and the close quarters. She had told herself the baby was not ready. The baby had its own opinion. Isham found a Jasper in the passage between the barn and the root cellar and said his wife's name, and Jasper understood immediately. He went back through the tunnel to where Fenwick was sitting with Gaston and said 2 words. Fenwick picked up his kit and followed. They worked in a corner of the barn that Celia had screened off with hanging horse blankets. The moment she understood what was happening, moving with the quick purposefulness of someone who had already thought about contingencies and was now simply executing them. Jessamine was asleep across the barn, her head on a folded coat, unknowing. Isham stood outside the blanket screen with one hand against the fabric, not pushing, just present. The lanterns inside threw moving shadows on the blanket. Outside the blanket, 30 people sat in various attitudes of wakefulness and sleep, and the storm roared above all of them and nobody spoke much. Fenwick worked steadily. Jasper stood at Abigail's head and let her grip his hand, because it was offered and because there was nothing else useful he could do in that moment. Abigail breathed in the particular concentrated way of women doing the hardest work available to any person, and she did not make more sound than was necessary, which was considerable but controlled. The child came at 2 in the morning. The cry was sharp and clear and completely distinct from every other sound in that barn, and it cut through the low roar of the storm and the breathing of 30 people and the shifting of horses with an authority that silenced everything else. Then after a moment, someone in the far corner of the barn began to cry. Then someone else, not grief, something that had no clean name, the specific emotion of people who have been afraid for a long time and have suddenly been given evidence that life is continuing regardless. Isham was allowed in. He knelt beside Abigail and looked at his son, who was small and furious and pink and entirely present. And his face did what faces do when they encounter something they had not understood was possible until it was directly in front of them. He looked up at Jasper, who was standing back to give them room. "Jasper," Isham said. His voice had the quality of a man who has selected very carefully from everything he could say. "I want to call him Jasper Isham Whitmore." Jasper Udell looked at Isham Whitmore for a long moment. He looked at Abigail, who nodded once, watching him. He looked at the child. He nodded. Then he walked out through the blanket screen and down the tunnel and sat alone in the passage between the barn and the root cellar in the dark, with his back against the timbered wall and his knees drawn up, and he put his face in his hands. Not in grief, in something that had no single name, either the feeling of a thing that was built from loss arriving after years of patient construction at something that was its opposite. He sat there for a while. No one came to find him. No one needed to. The storm broke on the morning of January 15th. It did not diminish gradually. It stopped with something approaching the same abruptness with which it had arrived, and the silence it left behind was enormous and ringing. The temperature was still very low, but the wind was gone, and without the wind, the cold was a different kind of cold one that could be survived. Jasper opened the exterior barn door and stood in the opening and looked at the world the storm had made. The snow was deep and undisturbed, shaped into long curves by the wind, every surface smooth and without mark. The sky was the particular blue of extreme cold after a storm of brilliant and pitiless and very clear. He walked out onto the snow and looked east toward the homesteads connected to the network. Smoke was rising from the ventilation gaps in the tunnel system, thin and steady, the evidence of continued life below the surface. He looked at those small columns of smoke rising in the cold blue morning for a moment. Then he turned and looked west. Plunkett's property was 400 meters away. The house was visible, large and solid against the white landscape. There was smoke from the chimney, which meant the house was intact and someone inside was alive. But the barn was further away, and between the house and the barn, there was an expanse of snow that told a story without requiring words. There was a disturbance in the snow between the well house and the barn, an area where the smooth surface had been interrupted and then covered again by drifting snow, but not completely. Not enough to erase the shape beneath it entirely. Jasper walked toward it. He found Aldous 40 meters from the barn. He had wandered past it in the white without knowing, turned somewhere in the blinding storm, and kept moving away from safety. Both water buckets were still in his hands, frozen solid where he had gripped them, the water inside long since turned to ice. He was on his knees in the snow, facing in the wrong direction, entirely close but not close enough, because in that storm there was no such thing as close enough. He was 23 years old. He had come from Ireland hoping for something different from what he had left, which was what everyone who came to Nebraska was hoping for, and he had found it for 6 months before the morning of January 13th had reduced all his hoping to a pair of frozen hands in a short distance he had not been able to cross. Jasper stood beside him in the snow and did not say anything and did not move for a while. He had seen death before. He had found Sadie in the snow and buried the child they lost and sat beside neighbors in their final hours. But this death had a particular quality that the others had not, because this death had been preventable in a way that none of the others had been, and the prevention had existed, had been offered, and had been refused by someone who had the authority to accept it. He walked to Plunkett's house. Plunkett opened the door before Jasper reached it. He had seen him coming across the snow. He looked like a man who had spent 3 days being afraid in a large house and had emerged from it smaller than he had gone in. His coat was too thin for the cold. He had been burning furniture, Jasper could tell from the smell that came out of the house with him. Plunkett looked at Jasper. He looked past him toward the disturbance in the snow near the barn. "Aldous," he said. "Yes." Plunkett stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Roland is in the barn. He's alive. He burrowed into the hay." He stopped. "His feet are bad." "Fenwick is here," Jasper said. "He can look at Roland." Plunkett nodded. His face had the quality of a man who has been stripped of something by a process too gradual to resist and too thorough to recover from. Not broken. Emptied. The things that had filled him, the certainty, the authority, the years of being the largest landowner and the loudest voice in the eastern settlement, had been burned away the same way his furniture had out of necessity to keep the cold at bay. He said, "My wife wants to leave." "I know," Jasper said. "She said she won't stay another winter on this land." He looked at the horizon. "But I have nowhere else to go. This is everything I built. If I leave this, I leave everything." Jasper waited. "I called you mad," Plunkett said. His voice was very level, the way voices get when the feeling underneath them is too large for inflection. "For 7 years I called you Ma, and I called you a burrowing creature, and I told this community that you were an embarrassment to the settlement. I organized a meeting to have your tunnels declared a hazard. I refused to let you dig on my land." He stopped. He looked at where Aldous lay in the snow. "A man is dead because of what I decided." Jasper said nothing. "Will you teach me?" Plunkett said. "Will you help me build tunnels on my property? I'll pay whatever you ask. I'll do whatever work you tell me. Just tell me it can still be fixed." Jasper looked at him for a long time. The man in front of him was not the same man who had laughed from horseback in September of 1881. That man had been full of himself in the way that men sometimes are when they have never been seriously tested. This man had been tested and had been found to have been wrong about the most important thing, and he was standing in the snow knowing it. I don't want your money, Jasper said, and I won't dig tunnels only for your property. Plunkett looked at him. The network needs to run through your land, not just to it. There are 7 homesteads west of you that have no connection to anything. That gap is what killed Aldous, not just the storm. The storm would have been survivable if the network had been complete. He looked at Plunkett steadily. If you let me dig a main passage through your property connecting east to west, I'll help you build whatever tunnels you need for your own buildings. No payment, just permission and your labor alongside mine. Plunkett's eyes filled. He did not look away or try to conceal it. Yes, he said. Whatever you need, yes. 2 weeks later, the schoolhouse in Thornfield held a gathering of the community. The dead had been buried. Roland, who had lost 3 toes to frostbite, was recovering at the Fenwick house. Odessa Plunkett had a cough that the cold had settled into her chest, and that Fenwick said would take the rest of the winter to fully clear. The whole of Thornfield came. The schoolhouse was not large enough for everyone, and people stood along the walls and in the doorway, and outside in the cold with the door open, listening. Mayor Quillen, who was not an elected official, but a man the community had agreed to treat as one, through long consensus, stood at the front and spoke about the storm and about the 3 people who had died in the wider Thornfield area, including Hattie Granger, whose family sat in the front row. He spoke about the 14 homesteads that had reported damage or loss. Then he turned to the back of the room where Jasper Udell was standing against the wall with the particular discomfort of a man who had always preferred to be useful rather than acknowledged. 31 people survived the storm in the eastern settlement, Quillen said. 31 people who were able to move between homesteads, share food and warmth and medical care, help each other through 3 days of conditions that killed 200 people across this territory. He paused. They survived because one man 7 years ago began digging tunnels that the rest of us called madness. The room was very quiet. Mr. Udell lost his wife to a blizzard. He could have let that loss close him down. Instead, he let it teach him something, and then he tried to teach it to the rest of us, and most of us declined to learn until the lesson was delivered at a cost we will not recover from quickly. Quillen's voice changed. We were wrong, all of us. We are grateful. Prescott Plunkett stood up. It took him a moment to find his balance. He walked to the front of the room with a steadiness that was clearly costing him something. He did not look at the audience, he looked at Jasper. I led the mockery, he said. For 7 years, I called him the Mole Man. I told this community that his grief had unhinged him and that his tunnels were an embarrassment. I refused his offer to connect my property and cut off 7 families from the network in doing so. He stopped. He breathed. My hired man is dead. My other worker will carry the damage from those 3 days for the rest of his life. My wife has not slept properly since the storm broke. Another pause. I can't undo those things. I can only stand here and say that I was wrong in every judgment I made about this man and his work, and that the cost of my being wrong was paid by people who had nothing to do with my pride. He turned to Jasper directly. You tried to save my people, he said. I turned you away. I am sorry. The schoolhouse was completely silent. Then Reverend Clem stood up. He was not at the front. He rose from the middle of the room, which made it a different kind of statement, and people turned to look at him. He did not perform the moment. He stood and said what he had come to say. I delivered a sermon in this community that used the language of faith to discourage something I did not understand and did not take the time to understand properly. I told people in words I chose carefully that trusting in human construction over divine protection was a form of pride. He looked at his hands and at Jasper. I was wrong about what I was looking at. The man who built those tunnels did not do it instead of faith. He did it because of it, because he believed that the death of the person he loved most was something he was obligated to respond to with more than grief. I mistook the depth of his conviction for the shallowness of his motive. He sat down. I am sorry, Jasper. Others stood, families who had laughed at the Mole Man and then sent their children through his passages to safety. Men who had voted in Plunkett's sitting room to classify the tunnels as a structural hazard. Women who had whispered at sewing circles about what happened to a man when grief took hold. One by one they offered what they had, which was not enough and was also all there was. When it was quiet again, Jasper walked to the front of the room. He was not comfortable there. He stood with the slight stiffness of a man who has spent 7 years working alone and has not practiced being the center of anything. He looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. My wife Sadie died 36 meters from our front door, he said. 36 meters. I found her the next morning with her hand reaching forward toward a home she couldn't find. I have thought about those 36 meters every day for 9 years. The room held its breath. The tunnels are not madness, he said. They are not engineering exactly. They are memory. They are a promise I made to Sadie that no one else would die reaching for a door they couldn't find if I could do anything about it. He looked around the room. I will teach anyone who wants to learn. The work is hard, but it is not complicated. The materials are not expensive. The time it takes can be shared across a community if the community decides it is worth sharing. He stopped. The storm will come again. It always comes again. The question is only whether we will have built something by the time it arrives. That summer, Thornfield dug. It was not the organized, well-funded effort of a community that had always known what it was doing. It was the improvised, sometimes argumentative, occasionally inspired effort of people who had decided that being right late was better than staying wrong. Jasper led the technical work. Celia Quarles organized the labor rosters and the material orders and the logistics of feeding work crews. Obadiah Gaston recovered enough to direct from a seated position, consulted on the timbering of the more difficult sections. Abigail Whitmore managed the accounting of costs and contributions with a thoroughness that Kellum Quarles said privately was more competent than anything the settlement had attempted before. Prescott Plunkett worked. That was the fact of it, simple and without qualification. He swung a pick and hauled dirt and carried timber and did the labor he had once considered beneath him, alongside people he had once considered beneath him, and he did it every day that the ground was workable. He was not the fastest worker or the most skilled. He was present, which was the thing that mattered most, and everyone could see it, which meant it mattered in a second way as well. Odessa Plunkett stayed. She found in the shared work of that summer something she had not had in the isolated prosperity of their large house, which was the particular satisfaction of being useful to people who needed what she could offer. She organized meals for the work crews. She learned Celia Quarles' system for tracking contributions and improved it. By autumn, she and Celia had become the kind of friends that form when two capable women discover each other through shared necessity. The main passage through Plunkett's property was finished in August. It was the longest single section of the network, running 80 meters through land that had resisted the shovel in the particular way of ground that has been compacted by decades of heavy agricultural use. It connected the eastern cluster to the 7 homesteads that had been isolated through the winter of 1888, completing the circuit that Jasper had drawn in his notebook 4 years earlier, and folded away when Plunkett said no. On the day the connection was made, Jasper opened the final door from the eastern side while a group of 15 people stood watching from the western end of the new passage. The door swung open. Light from 2 directions met in the middle of the tunnel. People began moving through. Plunkett was the last one, Sherbourne. He stood at the threshold of the door for a moment, at the boundary between the section of tunnel that ran under the community's land and the section that ran under his own, and he looked back east toward the network and then west toward the new connection. Then he stepped through. He did not make a speech. He bent his head slightly as he passed through the doorway, the involuntary gesture of a man for whom the moment was larger than any words available to it. The phrase entered the language of Thornfield that summer, digging a U-dell. It meant building a connection between people before the emergency rather than after it. It meant the kind of foresight that looks like over-preparation until the moment when it is the only thing standing between you and the consequences of not having prepared. People spoke it quietly and with the particular respect that communities sometimes develop for things that cost them something to learn. By the time of the Great Blizzard of 1899, the Thornfield network had grown to 32 connected homesteads and ran for nearly 5 kilometers beneath the prairie. The storm that arrived that January was measured afterward as comparable in intensity to the schoolhouse blizzard of 11 years before. The same wind speeds, the same temperature drops, the same annihilating visibility. Not a single person in the Thornfield settlement died. The children who had called Jasper Udell the Mole Man were adults by then. some of them with children of their own who had grown up knowing about the tunnels as simply a fact of life, the way a child grows up knowing about a well or a fence as infrastructure so fundamental that its existence requires no explanation. Those children did not call him the Mole Man. They called him by a name that had developed in the community over the years following 1888 without any formal decision or ceremony in the way names develop when they are true. They called him the Man Who Remembered. Jasper Udell passed in the spring of 1903 at the age of 65. He had been in failing health since the previous autumn, and he had arranged his affairs with the methodical care of a man who understood that the work outlasted the worker and wanted to make sure the transition was orderly. He left his property and the tunnel system under it to a trust he established with Isham Whitmore and Celia Quarles as its administrators, with instructions that the maintenance of the network was a community responsibility and that any homestead within reasonable distance that wanted a connection should receive one at community cost. He left one further instruction. He wanted to be buried in Minnesota beside Sadie on the homestead where she had died. He wanted to go back to the place where all of it had started. The people of Thornfield honored this without argument, which was itself a kind of honoring the quiet acknowledgement that some things are not for the community to decide. The marker the settlement placed at the tunnel entrance nearest his Nebraska cabin was installed in the spring of 1904. The inscription was carved by Obadiah Gaston, whose hands had recovered enough by then for careful work, and it read, "He built paths where there were none." In 1902, a year before he died, Jasper made one final journey. A settlement north of Thornfield sent word that they wanted to learn the tunnel system. They had heard about what happened in the blizzard of 1888 and again in 1899, and they had a community leader who was organizing the project and wanted to talk to the man who had designed it. Jasper rode north with Isham, who had offered to come along for the company, and because he said Jasper was getting old and shouldn't be riding alone, which was both true and an excuse, the community leader met them at the edge of the settlement. She was 20 years old, direct in her manner, and she looked at Jasper when he climbed down from the horse with an expression of such immediate recognition that Isham noticed it and looked between them, trying to understand what he was seeing. "You're him," she said, "Mr. Udell." "I am," Jasper said. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "My father used to tell me about you. He said you were the man who dug the tunnels in Thornfield." She looked at him steadily. "He said when I was little during the big storm, I ran through your tunnel by myself. He said I came out the other side and yelled that I had arrived." The world went very still. Isham looked at her. He looked at Jasper. He said very quietly, "Jessamine." She was Jessamine Whitmore. She was 20 years old, married the previous year, living in a new settlement north of Thornfield, and she was organizing her community to build a tunnel network because her father had told her from the time she was old enough to understand that the tunnels were the reason she had a brother and the reason her mother was alive. She had grown up with this knowledge the way she had grown up with her own name as something given to her before she could choose it, which had become over time simply who she was. Jasper stood in the cold northern morning and looked at the young woman who had run through his tunnel at 4 years old, shouting about having arrived, and he could find nothing to say that was adequate to the fact of her standing in front of him. "I have a question for you," Jessamine said. "I've wanted to ask it for a long time." She looked at him with the directness that was entirely her mother's. "You started building the tunnels because of your wife. I understand that. But you kept building them for other people for years, even when they laughed at you and refused you and called you names. Why, what made you keep going for other people when you had already done what you set out to do for her?" Jasper looked at her for a long time. He thought about the answer. He thought about all the answers that were partially true, but not completely true. He thought about Sadie and the rope experiment and the diagram on the back of the Bible and the first night he walked the completed tunnel in the dark and wept in the barn. He thought about Isham running through the January night with his heart in his throat. He thought about Abigail holding the lantern with Jessamine on her arm in the June smoke. He thought about 31 people living under the earth for 3 days while the storm tried to kill them and failing, and an infant crying at 2 in the morning with an authority that silenced everything else. He could not find the single answer because there was not one. "I'll think about it," he said, "and I'll tell you before I leave." He stayed 3 weeks. He walked the land with Jessamine and her husband and the other families of the settlement, and he measured distances and drew diagrams and explained what he had learned in 20 years of building underground passages in Nebraska soil. He answered every technical question accurately and without condescension, and he asked as many questions as he answered because every piece of ground was different, and the people who lived on it knew things about it that no outside expert could. On his last evening, he sat with Jessamine at her kitchen table, and she poured coffee and waited. "You asked me why I kept going for other people," he said. "After Sadie, after I had done the thing I set out to do." She nodded. "I built the first tunnel for Sadie," he said. "That's true, but when it was finished, I walked through it in the dark and I arrived. I found the door. I knew where I was." He turned the coffee cup in his hands, and I thought about how many people there were who did not have that, who would walk out into the dark or the storm, not knowing whether they would find their way, who would reach for doors they couldn't see. He was quiet for a moment. I could not stop knowing that. Once you know something, you can't go back to not knowing it. And if you can do something about what you know and you don't, then the not doing becomes its own kind of grief. Jessamine looked at him. "It wasn't for them at first," he said. "Not exactly. It was because knowing what I knew and doing nothing with it would have been another kind of death, a slower one." He set the cup down. "But then it was for them. Isham and Abigail and Celia and Obadiah and the 31 people in the barn on that second night. By then it was for them completely." He looked at her. "By then building it was how I remembered how to love something after a long time of not knowing if I still could." Jessamine did not say anything for a while. The lamp on the table burned between them, and outside the prairie was dark and cold and very large. "I'm going to build good tunnels," she said finally. "I know you are," Jasper said. He rode home the next morning with Isham through the long, pale light of a Nebraska autumn, and he did not speak much on the road, which Isham understood and respected. There was a particular silence that Jasper inhabited, sometimes not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had said what needed saying and was resting in the aftermath of it. He passed the following spring quietly in his sod house, with the sound of the prairie wind finding the gaps in the walls the way it always had. He had asked that no one be present at the end, and his request was honored, which was consistent with the way he had lived. He had never required an audience for the important things. They took him back to Minnesota as he had asked. They buried him beside Sadie on the ground, where she had died reaching for a door she couldn't find, and where he had knelt in the snow and understood the thing that would define the rest of his life. The marker there was simple and said what those who loved him wanted to say in the fewest possible words. The marker in Thornfield at the tunnel entrance nearest his cabin said what the community wanted to say. He built paths where there were none. What the children of Thornfield, who grew up crawling through those passages and emerging into each other's barns and root cellars, as though the underground were simply another room in a very large house. What those children said was simpler than any inscription. They said it the way children say things that are true without ceremony or self-consciousness as simple fact. They said Jasper Udell was the man who figured out how to get home in the dark. And in Nebraska in the years after the schoolhouse blizzard, there was no better thing to have been.